Okay, folks, well, look, welcome to Politics in the Pub for an incredibly important topic. I know just by listening to ABC Radio that there are all sorts of rival meetings going on tonight, not least one about Palestine. But be that as it may, this is an incredibly important topic with two, I may say, incredibly prestigious speakers on this topic. Professor Graeme Gill was a key academic leader in the Department of Government and International Relations at Sydney University, did his PhD on Russian issues at the London School of Economics, then went to Tasmania, University of Tasmania, and then, like an expensive English soccer player, was transferred to the University of Sydney. Ben Goldsmith did his PhD on Ukrainian-Russian relations, mostly in the Ukraine. Is that right?
Yes.
A fair bit in the Ukraine. Please welcome Graeme and Ben. On the topic, the Russian bear, a Putin problem, fear, fight, or accommodation.
Thank you very much, Stuart, for the introduction. And it's great to be here and have a chance to have beer while I give a talk, which is my first Politics in the Pub. Was the first time I did this, and I think it's something we should adopt at Sydney University. So Graeme and I are going to divide up the topic today. My area of expertise is really international relations and foreign policy, and my PhD was on Ukrainian and Russian foreign policies after the fall of the Soviet Union. So I'm going to start off talking about Russia and Russia's international behavior, and then give a few comments about international conflict, dynamics of conflict and peace, and try and not answer, but at least pose and propose some potential answers to some questions that I think are important. And then Graeme will talk more about Russia and Putin in particular. So I'll just start off with a few basic historical moments that I think we're all aware of, but just to sort of remind us and get the ball rolling. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych was elected president of Ukraine in a relatively free and fair election in a country transitioning to democracy, functioning, as a reasonable, plausible democratic system, defeating Yulia Tymoshenko. Yanukovych was known to be the more pro-Russian candidate, and Tymoshenko the more pro-Ukrainian nationalist candidate. And Ukraine, it's well known, is sort of divided between these two identities. In 2013, Yanukovych rejected an EU association agreement that was scheduled to be signed after receiving entreaties from Russia, from Vladimir Putin, and a pretty substantial offer of economic support. And although this was unexpected and it led to protests, it's hard to say that this was some sort of violation of democratic principles or violation of normal politics. The president of a country decided not to sign agreement with one group and was enticed by the offers of another state, neighboring state, that he already had and was known to have affinity to. But this led to protests. The pro-European, pro-Western groups in Ukraine and the pro-nationalist, anti-Russian groups strongly objected, and they saw this huge change in the path Ukraine was taking, and that led to occupation of the Independence Square, or Maidan Nezalezhnosti, in the center of Kiev. It led to violent political conflict in which protesters especially were killed by the security services. Yanukovych claims he didn't give the orders, but it became violent, and Ukraine seemed to be on the verge of civil war. Yanukovych lost a lot of support, especially after the deadly violence and fled or left for eventually arriving in Russia in exile. And that was in February of 2014. By March of 2014, Russian forces had appeared in Crimea, this hotly contested, historically, for a good part of its history, historically very tied to Russia, territory where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is based. Russian troops appeared there, and Russia annexed this territory of Ukraine. Then in April of 2014, separatists began fighting the Ukrainian authorities in two eastern provinces or oblasts of Ukraine, the area called the Donbass, this heavily Russian identifying part of Ukraine. These groups, at least in my, based on the evidence that I know, in my view, heavily backed and clearly backed by Russia and by Putin, part of a fairly clear strategy of Putin, as was this sort of lightning and peaceful takeover of Crimea. And we've had this civil war going on and off, hotter and colder, backed by the neighboring country, Russia. Since then, in July 2014, you had the shooting down of the Malaysian Airlines flight, which also seems to be pretty clearly under, something that was done with some Russian complicity. Certainly, it wasn't the intention, as far as I can imagine, the intention to shoot down a Malaysian passenger plane, but it did happen. And well, maybe someone will disagree. And then in September of 2015, Russia intervened in the Syrian civil war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Best thing that ever happened.
Okay.
Stopped at the coming of G had one win.
Okay, Brian.
Okay. Time for beer. So I have a few questions that I want to pose, and then I want to talk about principles of international politics, but also sort of how we deal with this evidence that we have that is really pretty mixed. Different people can make very different interpretations of the same evidence, probably based on what we our pre-existing ideas and beliefs. So 3 questions. Is Russia's assertive foreign policy since 2014 a Putin problem, as the title of the talk implies, or is it fairly understandable great power foreign policy? Second, is Russian foreign policy behavior a problem for global peace and security? A lot of people, especially in the West, especially in the US, where I'm originally from, seem to assume that this is actually a major problem. But I want to take a step back and think about whether this is a serious problem for international peace and security. And then a question whose answer relies a lot on how you answer the other questions. What is the best way for the US, Germany, the European Union, and NATO to respond to this Russian behavior? Okay. And how much time do I have?
Now you've got another 10 minutes.
Another 10 minutes, okay.
At least.
So I want to start by talking about something completely different. So Alfred Hitchcock is one of my favorite movie directors, and the other night my partner and I were watching Rear Window, which I think is one of the great movies. I really enjoy it, and I like it because, what are the reasons? Because I think that it has a theme about the tension between intuition and evidence. So probably most of you know the movie, but a guy has a broken leg. He's a photographer. He's stuck looking out the back window of his apartment in New York, and he thinks he sees a murder, but he doesn't actually see the murder. He sees a guy carry a suitcase out of his apartment 3 times between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. His invalid wife, who constantly nags him, disappears. And he's making long-distance phone calls, and he sits in his apartment and smokes a cigarette at night in the dark. He thinks there's a murder, and he calls his friends, his old war buddy from World War II, who's a detective, and the guy says, I have nothing here. I can't. You have to give me evidence to get a search warrant. But his intuition is Jimmy Stewart. His intuition is there's a murder. So. And, there's a love story as well in the
Give us a love story.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The logical answer to the love story is that Jimmy Stewart's a rough and tumble photographer who wants to go out to Africa and take photos in war zones, and his girlfriend is a fashion executive, very beautiful, and can only live in New York City. And so Jimmy Stewart saying, this won't work out, we have to split up. But they can't bring themselves to split up. So their intuition somehow, it's contrary to the words they say, keeps them together. And then at the end, it's great. At the end, right, because they go through the process of trying to solve the murder, they have all this common, they realize that they can make it work. But outside of Hollywood, when you see evidence like this, guy leaving his apartment a few times at night, you'd probably be like the detective. You say, there's not a lot to go on here. What are we going to do? And you're not able to come to a conclusion that there has been a murder, but still you might have a doubt. So Graeme knows I use a lot of math and I talk a lot about probabilities in my research, but this is a classic problem. If you're testing a hypothesis, you just have insufficient evidence. And often, international relations and international conflict problems are exactly like this. And this, I always say this to my students, and they scoff, or they're very skeptical, but you have to have some sympathy, or at least empathy, for the decision makers in these situations, trying to figure out exactly what kind of situation they're in. And so the questions that I'm posing about Putin and Putin's behavior in Russia and its supposed belligerence, I think in some fundamental way get to, or face this problem. We're asking, as game theorists might say, we're asking what type of leader of a great power is Putin? Is he someone who's expansionist? Is he someone who's inherently aggressive and has this big plan that we really need to be worried about? Or is he someone that's just following national Russian identity and having spent a lot of time in Russia and feeling very comfortable there and spent a good amount of time in Crimea, I can very well understand the Russian identity with Crimea. You speak Russian there, you don't really speak Ukrainian very much, et cetera, et cetera. So is this as far as he'll go, and is it very understandable? From the point of view of how to react to this, it's actually a problem of very limited information on which we have to make these huge decisions. And so I think I don't have enough time to talk about everything I'd want to talk about, but I really want to get down to this sort of this personal conundrum I have that is sort of one of the areas where I'm looking for new research topics, but I think also more generally a real problem in international politics today. So I don't believe that international law itself is very powerful in a world of sovereign states. So international law can be broken by sovereign states. Sovereign states, by definition, cannot be bound by international law because they're sovereign. There's no authority higher than the sovereign state in the basic definition of sovereignty. So this is a fundamental problem if we were thinking about a world governed by international laws, which I think would be a great thing, but I don't think that exists. But I do believe that norms, understandings, political culture, and lessons of history are very powerful. And one example from, that there's a nice paper in the international relations literature on is The End of Slavery, which argues that it's not economic factors, it's not other things, it's this change in moral views of people that really led to the end of slavery. So I'm seeing more and more evidence of what I see as forgetting the lessons of history on issues like refugees and asylum seekers, territorial integrity, aggressive use of force, moderation and tolerance in democratic politics, like Bernie Sanders' opponents in the U.S., and the value of democratic politics itself, where democracy seems to have been degraded in people's minds, maybe in a justifiable way. So I have this conundrum: is how do we continue to avoid the cycles of warfare and patterns of injustice that have been the norm in human history if we keep forgetting these lessons of history? Because I see the lessons that came out of World War II fundamentally of not changing borders by the use of force as being degraded, and partly that's a process of forgetting, partly that's a process of the countries that didn't learn the same lessons, like Russia, which took very different lessons from the end of World War II, or somewhat different, and especially China. They have learned different lessons from history than we in the West, or than at least when I was growing up and studying these things in the US. So now we're getting this clash of a wider world, a wider set of lessons, and it seems that some lessons, if you look at the migration situation in Europe now, some lessons are forgotten over some number of generations. So that to me is very troubling. But I want to end, if I have a couple more minutes. So to answer my questions, I don't think actually that we have a Putin problem. I certainly agree that Putin is a different leader, and another leader in Russia, like Medvedev, the current prime minister, would not have had the same, what seems like a fairly belligerent or force-focused foreign policy. Nevertheless, I do see Russia's foreign policy as, not out of line with the foreign policies of many great powers, especially over the longer sweep of history, and many countries today that assert their interests and care very much about territory and historical identity. But that, in a sense, that's a pessimistic argument, I think, because we see normal great power behavior that's especially normal for the first half of the 20th century or 19th or 18th centuries, which means that cycles of warfare and countries coming into conflict over territory, which has been shown again and again in the literature I know to be the most likely issue to escalate to full-scale warfare among countries, that these cycles are more likely as these lessons that we thought we had learned at the end of World War II are maybe being forgotten. So is Russian foreign policy behavior a problem for global peace and security? I think it really is. It's a problem for the post-World War II order as we've known it. It might be a good thing to reshape that order in some way, but I think it's something that we really need to worry about, because taking territory by force is the single most dangerous thing that's happened in human history, in my view, or at least one of them. I have another project on genocide forecasting, so I'm often governments are more dangerous to their own populations than others. But and I'll have an example about the U.S. in a second. The analogy that I don't have time to go into, but I think is actually a reasonable analogy to make, and analogies are often what we fall back on when we have too limited information. Analogies are insufficient, but nevertheless, the analogy of Germany's taking of the Sudetenland and Russia's taking of Crimea and pressure on Donbass, I think is apt for the basic principles of international law. And in fact, you can, with 90% of the population of Sudetenland being ethnic German and definitely wanting secession, a free and fair vote certainly would have been won. And this division being imposed on Germany and very unfair treaty at the end of World War I. I think the case for Germany taking Sudetenland is at least as strong as the case for Russia taking Crimea. I don't think Putin is like Hitler in ambitions or hatred or anything else, But I think this is exactly the kind of situation that we need norms and rules to allow states to negotiate without force. And it seems like we're losing that ability, and that worries me. And so what's the best way to respond? And I'll just leave it at this, and then critics of U.S. foreign policy could jump on me in Q&A. I think the way the U.S. and Germany in particular have handled the response to Putin is about as good as you could hope for. It's measured in the sense that it doesn't use force, it doesn't arm the Ukrainian rebels, but it tries to impose very high costs on Russia. And I see this as essential, not necessarily because Russia is so important, because Russia isn't as important, definitely, as it used to be. It's becoming less and less important as its economy becomes, falls further and further behind other growing economies. But what's important about imposing these costs is the signal it sends to China, because China and its growing power, and it even though it's slowed down, its almost inevitable ability to challenge the U.S. or the U.S. and the EU as the dominant global military power within some period of time. You can't predict how much, but certainly with such a large population and growing economy, China will muster these resources in a way that Russia simply cannot. That this disputes over the South China Sea that we see now are extremely worrying, extremely dangerous, because it's a fundamental clash of identities where the Chinese see this as obviously something that should be decided in their favor, and most outsiders, not just Vietnamese and Philippines, but certainly U.S. and Europe less so, see this as obviously something that cannot be tolerated and a threat. So I see this as a very dangerous situation, and I see the most important thing to do is to signal the costs, with the most likely positive outcome being a negotiated settlement that basically grants great powers some of what they want in violation of other states' territorial integrity or claims, recognizing that great powers are great powers, and you need to, in the history of international relations, basically appease or concede it's to some degree, but not allowing the situation to spiral into warfare by granting too much in that bargain. So raise the costs enough so that basically China and the West and Russia and the West can come to agreements over these territorial issues without the use of force. So I'll stop there and hand over to Graeme.